Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, great to have your company. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The Coalition calls Labor's bluff on its rush detainee legislation, rightly demanding more scrutiny given just how much Labor has botched on this issue so far. At the same time, serious cracks emerge between the Minister and the Chief Bureaucrat of her department. Fresh from his back down on vehicle emissions, Energy Minister Chris Bowen now forced to walk back his absurd electric vehicle target. 89% he once thought of EVs by 2030. Now, I'm not complaining, but at this rate, the Minister won't have any policies left pretty soon. Plus, strippers and marijuana festivals, they're just a couple of the things reportedly being offered up to people on the NDIS. The states are gearing up for a fight with Bill Shorten as he starts to overhaul the disability scheme. And with just one sitting day now before the 6-week break before the May budget, Labor are a rabble. Yes, it's bad on the detainee issue, but when you've got ministers literally running away from the media at Parliament House, it's only a matter of time before they resign or face the sack.
Do you expect legal challenges to come out of this legislation if it's passed?
I'm so sorry, I've got to go to a meeting.
This is major legislation. This is major legislation and you're not taking questions.
But first, it's the oldest political trick in the book. When you're in trouble, blame the other side. And on this, Labor is audacious.
We are working together to reform a department that was left in an absolute mess by the Leader of the Opposition. The mess left by the Leader of the Opposition left in a catastrophic mess by the Leader of the Opposition. NZYQ would not even have been here were it not for the incompetence of the Leader of the Opposition.
Order.
I make no apologies for doing everything I could to get this person out of the country. I'd contrast that with the Leader of the Opposition because he's the reason that NZYQ was here to begin with.
Now, make no mistake, this border mess is Labor's fault. Labor's fault originally for allowing into the country some 50,000 illegal arrivals by boat under Kevin Rudd and then Julia Gillard. And now under Anthony Albanese for failing to adequately deal with the High Court's demand that just one foreign criminal be released from detention, and instead they panicked, letting out all 149 into the community with no plan at all about how to keep Australians safe. Since then, we've had murderers, rapists, violent criminals and pedophiles out on the street, a government unwilling to disclose where they are, and now these criminals refusing to subject themselves to monitoring and using taxpayer dollars via activists to challenge their ankle bracelets through the courts. But because the opposition has failed to roll over to the government's latest plan to make it a criminal offence not to cooperate with attempted repatriation, the whole mess is somehow Peter Dutton's fault. In a panicked press conference today, the first of many months that she's fronted the camera, Claire O'Neill, joined by the hapless Andrew Giles, two of the government's worst ministers, well, they managed to accuse the opposition of playing politics at least a dozen times.
Peter Dutton, Dr. No himself, comes forward and plays political games, an opposition that continues to play politics.
Peter Dutton always plays politics. They've chosen once again to play politics.
Tries to play politics. And we saw that this week, and that is because they are playing politics.
Like performing seals, aren't they? Reading out the talking points written by the Prime Minister's office. Now, hang on. This is a government that only gave the opposition the draft legislation at 7:30 yesterday morning. But they had the document printed last Friday. So who's playing politics, asking the opposition to come to a decision just about an hour or so before it's launched into the Parliament, or a government that could have taken the opposition into their confidence last week and given Dutton and his team the weekend to consider the bill, to ask detailed questions and perhaps even suggest improvements. Now, as it happens, the opposition worked with the government to get the latest foreign criminals bill through the House of Representatives, but then voted with a crossbench to have a proper inquiry. Not just those 2 hours last night, meaning the legislation will then be voted on in budget week, about 6 weeks away. Now, what's wrong with that? Especially as ministers and officials were adamant last night that the latest legislation would make no difference to any foreign detainee, any case currently before the courts.
Just interested if this legislation is designed to deal with issues that are likely to arise from ASF 17, the upcoming matter in the High Court.
The legislation doesn't deal with the matter before the High Court is whether or not people who remain in immigration detention for a protracted period of time where they're not cooperating with removal, whether they're affected by the NZYQ decision. The passage of this legislation or not has no relevance to the outcome of that High Court case.
That the bill does not respond to the proceedings currently before the High Court in relation to ASF 17?
That's right. Does not respond to the points of law that are being tested in ASF 17.
That's Michaelia Cash there, of course, in those hearings last night. She'll join us on the show a little later in the program. But having spent years to demonise Peter Dutton as a thug, as a brute, this latest tactic that he's somehow softened border protection, I mean, that verges on farcical. Today, Minister O'Neill said it was the coalition that somehow had driven border protection into a ditch.
Peter Dutton drove this system into a ditch and then walked away. Now we are having to go through a methodical process of fixing each aspect of this system.
Ditch? Good Lord, I'd take Dutton's ditch over her absolute train wreck handling of border protection. But does anyone honestly think that the party that stopped the boats is somehow to blame for the boat people that Labor let in? I mean, the desperation, the hysteria that's creeping into ministerial language, that's a sign of a government that's losing control. Today in the Parliament, O'Neill sounded shrill. But never mind the government's problems with hundreds of foreign criminals let loose into the community. Who can forget there's also Australia's out-of-control lawful immigration, currently running at well over 500,000 people a year, which explains our housing crisis. And the lived reality, too, of a per capita recession, given we've had 4 quarters now of negative growth per person. This week, we've had a slight step back from the new vehicle emissions rules that will make families and tradies driving utes and 4-wheel drives subsidise those with money in their pocket to drive Teslas, but no one's really happy, are they? There's increasing concern from business that Labor's renewable energy push means even more jobs will head offshore, and unreliable power in Australia is a thing of the past, where it used to be reliable and cheap. I mean, Labor's pre-election promise to cut your power bills by $275, forget that. There's growing alarm too amongst people of faith that the government's planning to make it impossible for them to keep their faith-based schools. Even the NDIS that Labor regards as some sort of trophy achievement, well, that's got costs exploding, rorts exploding, and almost no consensus amongst Labor premiers about a Fed income solution. Now, tomorrow night, Labor MPs will leave Canberra thoroughly demoralised. They're down in the polls, even the PM's popularity is taking a beating, and they're unable to point to any real achievements as they ebb closer and closer to the next election. Labor strategists will be looking to the May budget for a reset. We heard about that reset over Christmas, but it's never materialised. But as they discovered with those stage 3 tax cuts, it's hard to buy your way out of political trouble, particularly when you've got a lie to try and do it. All right, we'll go to camera now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
The Albanese government has failed in its bid to ram through Parliament tough new powers to lock up detainees.
The day started with the Home Affairs Minister refusing to answer questions.
This is major legislation.
The advice you have that these laws won't get thrown out by the High Court.
Hours later, the coalition confirmed it would delay the bill that would jail detainees who refuse to cooperate.
We are very concerned about unintended consequences.
In the Senate, the Coalition, Greens and Crossbench teamed up to kick the proposal off to an inquiry.
This was like some sort of kiddies crayon drawing.
To say that the last 24 hours has been chaotic is an absolute understatement.
It won't report back until May 7. That's after a pivotal High Court hearing next month. The Home Affairs and Immigration Ministers frustrated with the delay.
The opposition, instead of supporting us, instead of being constructive, instead of working with us on these things, tries to play politics.
Peter Dutton always says no.
Claiming the powers are needed urgently, but unable to explain why.
This is one of the most common sense things that I have seen come before the Parliament.
Feeling the heat, the pair walked away again.
Yep, we've got to go. We've got to wrap up. Thanks, guys.
Well, Claire O'Neill now has a stitch. She's run away from 2 press conferences today.
The government is vowing to crack down on fraud within the NDIS and ensure the money goes to those most in need.
Participants will be given a set budget with no automatic top-ups after they've spent their original plan. It will also seek to define what is, and crucially what isn't, an appropriate support service.
Ignoring price gouging and unethical conduct is a betrayal of NDIS participants and Aussie taxpayers and jeopardises the credibility and the social licence of the scheme.
Bill Shorten pushed ahead with the NDIS reforms despite Labor premiers threatening to blow up the funding deal agreed to last year.
They're not able to tell us how much New South Wales taxpayers will be on the hook.
We do not believe very firmly that it reflects the agreement that was struck.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Goodness me, there's a lot to get through, isn't there? I'm joined now by Sky News host and National Affairs Editor for The Telegraph, James Morrow, and Sky News Senior Reporter Carolyn Marcus. Well, welcome to you both. I've got to say, James, I tell you, I watched everything today from start to finish, and I thought to myself, Peter, where do you start tonight? I mean, this is another day of chaos on another week of chaos, that rushed attempt with this legislation. And the opposition, some media outlets are saying that they're refusing to pass the laws. They're not. They want a proper inquiry. No. Why wouldn't they? I mean, it's been a calamity of failures ever since the government touched this issue. And they want some scrutiny on the legislation. They got confirmation last night in that hearing. You heard it there in those comments from officials. They don't regard this as urgent in relation to that High Court decision. So they say it's not urgent. It's confirmed it's not urgent. Well, then let's have a proper inquiry. But give me your take.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I think the thing that's happened here, Peter, is that Labor, having been caught on the back foot with the legislation over NZYQ and then trying to blame the coalition for playing politics, has now decided to go in the other direction, but they've been caught out on this. You know, they thought what they would do is say, oh, this is really urgent, this is really important, and then, you know, force it through the last couple of days of Parliament. As far as I know, they actually had this legislation ready to go on Friday, and yesterday the coalition got a call at 7:30 in the morning saying, hey, have a look at this. So you can see what this is all about. But it's all blown up spectacularly in their face. And it's a huge embarrassment, Peter, for the government to have the coalition, the team up with the Greens and the crossbenchers in the Senate to say, hang on. There are processes here. We need to know what this is all about, what it's going to achieve, what it's meant to solve. And there are so many questions that are left unanswered about this legislation, not the least of which is what happens to one of these detainees after they serve the term of this sentence.
You used the word embarrassment there, James, and I have to say, looking at I'd have to regard it as some of the most inept media management I've seen from Claire O'Neill's office. I've watched that last night and again today. Here's a little bit for people at home to follow what's happened.
As we're identifying gaps in our system, we are moving as quickly as we can to fill those gaps.
Our government's really committed to transparency. I'm so sorry, I've got to go to a meeting.
This is major legislation. This is major legislation, and you're not taking questions on it.
What's your response? It's very difficult for the coalition to support such a rushed passage of this legislation.
Everyone ready to go? Cameras all good? Yes. Okay, instead of doing what's in the national interest, okay? Yep, we've got to go. We've got to wrap up. Thanks.
Why are you avoiding questions, Minister? Why are you avoiding scrutiny?
Carolyn, you've been in the media a lot longer than me. I've been around that building probably a lot longer than you. I mean, when you start having the Parliament building look like the scenes out the front of a criminal court, you know, cameras chasing ministers down corridors, as we've seen in the last 48 hours. It's a shocking look. And I'd say there as a staffer, that minister is on death row.
Look, Peter, I have been in the media a long time. A lot of that time has been spent at court and chasing bad guys on current affairs shows. And let me tell you, I have one tip for you. Whether you are a dodgy tradie or you are a federal minister, do not run from the cameras. Do not treat the journalists with contempt, because all you do is make yourself look shadier and hand the journalists an even bigger story. That's the type of footage that we would use on television as promotional material, because it is more dramatic than just stopping and answering a simple question, which is what she could have done in reality. I mean, surely it's comms 101 not to do that.
You are spot on. That's the advice that most good staff would give their boss. Just front the camera, don't run away, don't look like you're in current affair. And you've just reiterated that. What about this allegation, James, that O'Neill reduced her departmental head to tears? And this is Stephanie Foster. She did the very transparent thing. She put out the detail, a table listing the crimes and the number of people committing those particular crimes out of the 149 released last year. Big feature of Question Time today, pushed very hard by Susan Lee, the Deputy Liberal leader. But again, this is not a good look if you're reducing public servants to a blubbering mess, is it?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, it's going to bring back, of course, memories of Claire O'Neill and Mean Girls sort of talk. But it's also, if you go back and you watch Question Time, I was in there, I was in the House watching every question that Susan Ley dropped on the minister over this. And she kept saying, I have answered this question, I've answered this question. But she never answered the question and said yes or no, whether or not she, in fact, did reduce the secretary to tears or an emotional state. And there was a very telling question that Susan Ley asked where she said, were there other public servants in the room, in the office with you when this occurred, which suggests to me that this is stitching up the idea that there were, in fact, other witnesses to this event. But no, it's a terrible look for the minister, and it's a terrible look also for a government that has talked about transparency. I mean, this document, these figures, the media was trying to get them for the longest time, and they said, oh, well, you know, that's not for us, that's for the state and territory police to deal with. We don't know, we wash our hands of it. They're not being transparent, and it's also, you know, not very good for the claims that they had about improving the culture of Parliament either, is it, Peter?
Not at all. Our good friends, Caroline, at the ABC RMIT Fact Check Unit, they've had to issue a grovelling apology to Dick Smith after they published a report on renewable energy that he claimed was full of lies. Smith spoke to Chris Kenny, of course, on Monday and said he was getting legal advice on the issue, which I think probably led to this apology. What did you think?
Well, it was extraordinary because they spent about a day trying to defend this fact check unit's report initially, and then they had this incredible back down, which, as you point out, probably had to do with a legal letter, and then posted a written apology online to Dick Smith. They basically accused him of saying that Australia should use nuclear energy and that he was bagging renewables. But he's pointed out he never did that. He never said that we shouldn't use renewable energy as part of the mix. He said we should simply look at adding nuclear to that mix. And it was clear that the fact-check unit had taken him completely out of context and been utterly misleading on it, which they've apologised now for. But I don't need to tell you, Peter, about how woeful these fact-check units have been, whether they are the RMIT one that the ABC relies on or the one that Meta or Facebook uses. With your own experience when you talked during the Voice campaign about the Uluru Statement from the Heart being more than that one page that the government and the Yes campaign was trying to push that it was. In reality, it was many more pages than that. And yet the fact-check unit for Facebook tried to insist that this was somehow false information. I mean, time and again, we've seen how they lack any sort of integrity, and that they're really completely useless, because when it comes to fact-checking, they're the ones that need to be fact-checked.
Spot on. James and Caroline, have a lovely Easter. I'll catch up with you both on the other side of next week. All right, you've seen all that detail now. Labor failing in their push to put those emergency laws through the Parliament today. Confirmation, of course, in that inquiry last night that they are not urgent in relation to the High Court case. The appearance today, too, of the ministers, Andrew Giles, Claire O'Neill. They've hidden from the media for many, many weeks. They fronted the media. They were asked particular questions. Was this bill urgent and why? They couldn't answer them. They shut down the press conference and they ran back into Parliament House. It is a mess. But listen to this from Sunrise this morning, and a whole lot of stonewalling from Claire O'Neill over those allegations. She had her departmental secretary in tears.
Our government's really committed to transparency. The information was requested of government. Government provided the information.
It's not just chaos, not just incompetence, but potentially conspiracy to deceive too. And I think, Claire, the question for you here is, did either you, did anyone in your office, did anyone in your government direct a public servant to either delay or to keep confidential information that had been asked for by the Australian public, by the Senate?
Jane,
is not transparency.
You're actually sounding crazy right now. You're actually sounding crazy right now.
And you sound like you're lying, Claire.
For more on this, I'm joined now by Shadow Attorney-General Michaelia Cash. We'll start with that one, actually, if we might, Michaelia Cash, because for me the issue is less about a departmental secretary in tears. Only if we were in the room would we know that. But what she was apparently pulled into line about was her being transparent by the Australian people and releasing the crimes for which these 149 released criminal detainees have been put into jail for. Now, for a government that was elected saying they would be transparent, I think Stephanie Foster's doing the right thing here and not the minister.
Absolutely. What did Stephanie Foster do? She did what the government should have been doing, Peter, and that is provide the Australian people with the truth. And I agree with those comments of Jane Hume. There are now serious questions for Minister O'Neill to answer. Did she or did anyone in her office direct the public service to not provide the information to the Australian Senate? That is an incredibly serious question that needs to be answered. But I say to Stephanie Foster, thank you for doing what the government should have, and as I said, telling the Australian people the truth about the 151 hardcore criminals that this government, Ms O'Neill, Mr Giles, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese let out into the Australian community under their watch. There are very serious questions now that need to be answered, both by Mr Albanese as Prime Minister. What is his knowledge of what Ms O'Neill did or didn't direct the public service to do?
Claire O'Neill today wanted to make this all about Peter Dutton. You know, it was his catastrophic handling of the portfolio. It was Peter Dutton this to Peter Dutton that. Now, they've invested a couple of years, Labor, in demonising Dutton as being tough and vigilant and, you know, a cop in a suit sort of persona. I can't see how they can flip it now and say he's soft on all of these issues and this is somehow his fault. Do you think it's plausible that Dutton will carry the can with the Australian community?
Peter Dutton is renowned as a principled and hardline politician. Peter Dutton can stand on his record and the record of the former coalition government, in particular when it comes to the border protection portfolio. The last time I checked, Peter, it wasn't Peter Dutton who let 151 hardcore criminals, including rapists, pedophiles and murderers, out onto the street. That is squarely on Mr Albanese, Ms O'Neill and Mr Giles. But I have to say, the performance of Claire O'Neill today, she almost made Andrew Giles look competent, running away from journalists on 2 occasions. Peter, all the journalists wanted to know was what we had wanted to know last night. You have said you have urgent legislation. It must pass the Parliament with no scrutiny. Can you just tell us what is the urgency? A very simple question, but one this government is unable to answer. But Peter, can I just give you a few more dates? Because what we also found out last night was this. The government identified an issue in February. In relation to this urgent legislation that we saw yesterday at 7:30 a.m, They issued drafting instructions on the 5th of March. If it's so urgent, why didn't you bring the coalition into your confidence back then? Because, Peter, as we now know, the government cannot articulate the urgency. It is complete chaos and confusion when it comes to border protection in this country under Mr Albanese and his hapless ministers, Mr Giles and Ms O'Neill.
Surely she's got to go now.
Well, as I said, there's poor performance in the portfolio. There's a refusal to take responsibility. But I have to say, questions now being asked in relation to whether or not a direction was provided to a public servant to withhold information that the Senate had asked for on behalf of the Australian people. Well, I have to say, that takes it to an all-new level. I mean, this government, Peter, remember what Mr Albanese used to say prior to the election? If you voted for me, you heralded in as a country a new era of transparency in a government. This government is without a doubt the most secret of governments Australia has ever seen. And I say has ever seen. I've never seen anything like it. I mean, look at what they're doing. Peter, talk about religious discrimination and secrecy. How does an Attorney-General of Australia gag faith leaders from talking about some of the most important matters to them? I mean, on what planet do we now live that the Attorney-General of Australia, sanctioned by our Prime Minister, says to faith leaders, we will only consult with you if you are sworn to secrecy in relation to what we've told you? Peter, this is farcical. As I said, Seinfeld could not script at the moment what is going on in relation to this government. But quite frankly, it doesn't surprise me.
Michaelia Cash, thank you.
Great to be with you.
Before we go to the break, the ABC has been forced to issue a clarification. Following an interview with Victorian Liberal leader John Pizzuto, the broadcaster has conceded that viewers of the 7:30 report interview, which aired last year, and I'll quote, may have understood the interview to suggest that British activist Kellie J Keane has associations with neo-Nazis. It's been reported that the ABC has now reached a confidential out-of-court settlement with Kellie J Keane while she continues her defamation action against Pizzuto. Well, there you go. That could have ramifications more broadly. After the break, one day on from his back down on fuel efficiency standards, Chris Bowen again having to walk back another target. This is ideology over good policy, isn't it? Plus, one European country has just put itself on high alert for a terror attack. So given our own spies here say there's a realistic possibility in Australia of an Islamist attack, just how concerned should we be? Welcome back. Still to come, has this Labor government just become useful idiots for Beijing? Greg Sheridan will weigh in on that shortly. But first, yet another embarrassment for Chris Bowen today, with the minister walking away from his ambitious and frankly absurd EV target of 89% electric vehicles by 2030. This came after his own department predicted fewer than a third of all new cars in that time frame would be electric. Couple this with the poor response from experts to his revamped fuel efficiency standards out yesterday, and it's a shocker of a week for Bowen. Joining me now, Shadow Energy and Climate Minister Ted O'Brien. Ted O'Brien, thank you for your time. It always seemed inevitable. I mean, the minister's policies are based on ideology rather than experts and facts and looking at what's happening overseas. But are you surprised to see a double-headed backflip, which is one yesterday and one today from Chris Bowen?
Not surprised at all, Peter. If you think of every single target this minister has come up with, it has been a disaster. He was the one who promised the $275 reduction in household power bills. Fail. 82% renewables on the grid by 2030. Everyone knows that's going to fail. 43% emissions reduction. Everyone knows that's going to fail. And of course, this one, the electric vehicle sales, 89% by 2030. His own department, as you point out, say it's going to come in at less than a third, at 27%. I think what's happened is Chris Bowen has instinctively gotten desperate, and he just wants to achieve the target. And that is why, under the guise of a fuel efficiency standard, he has introduced a family car tax. So the government can tell families what cars they have to drive so he can meet his target.
Yeah, well, look, 6 years' time, I doubt he'll even be in the parliament, let alone the minister. And this guy's got form. I mean, let's not forget the worst ever record of boats arriving unlawfully to Australia in our history, Chris Bowen. The attacks on negative gearing, Chris Bowen. Going after self-funded retirees, Chris Bowen. I mean, how he's even got a job is beyond me. And then yesterday, Ted O'Brien, we had that shocking performance in the parliament where you've got Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, talking about almost $5 billion Australian taxpayers will spend in the UK building basically a nuclear reactor to go inside a submarine, followed up by that clown Bowen saying, oh, we don't like nuclear, it's too expensive, we can't use it, and Australians have moved on. Now, if it's okay in sea, nuclear power, why can't we have nuclear power on land?
Yeah, precisely, Peter. So here's what we saw in the parliament this week. We had the Defence Minister saying that nuclear reactors are safe. The Energy Minister saying nuclear reactors are unsafe. The Defence Minister saying that Australia will be able to manage the waste and spent fuel from nuclear reactors. The Energy Minister saying Australia will not be able to manage waste from nuclear reactors. You've got the Defence Minister saying Australia has the capability of managing this technology. The Energy Minister saying Australia has no capability to manage this technology. So not only is there a split in views between two very senior ministers, but I point out that these both sit on the National Security Committee of Cabinet, our peak decision-making body on national security issues. What message is Chris Bowen sending our AUKUS partners in saying Australia has no idea how to manage nuclear technology? What message is he sending to younger Australians who want to embrace next generation technologies, saying that, well, 30 other countries can do this already, another 50 are lining up to do it, but Australia, you can't do it. You don't have the capability. It's a wrong message for allies. It's a wrong message for the next generation of young Australians.
Keep it up, Ted O'Brien. I can feel the tides turning. You're absolutely at the beachhead there. And I hadn't thought about the impact with our AUKUS partners, but you're absolutely spot on. Have a good Easter. Thanks for joining me tonight. Let's return to something now I touched on last night with John Anderson, and that's Labor's concerning drift when it comes to national security. In particular, the way the Albanese government has gone from trying to improve the relationship with China to now what appears to be out-and-out kowtowing to Beijing. The foreign editor of The Australian, Greg Sheridan, he wrote a fantastic article yesterday and he joins me now. Greg, your article, I thought, was just extraordinary. Yes, you picked up those points about expelling the security chiefs from the NSC and the review of ASPI, but you go way beyond this. What else has Labor done that benefits Beijing?
Well, Peter, great to be with you. And that's right. I think the expulsion of the intelligence chiefs from the NSC, and they've been there forever, for years and years and years and years and years. So this is what Paul Keating demanded, what Beijing wanted, and the Albanese government has delivered it. A grotesque thing. They won't defend the security chiefs and then they expel them from the NSC. So they'll only be there when called upon. And then they've already hobbled and may well destroy the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which was one of Beijing's 14 demands of the Australian government. But as well, they've stopped mentioning China as a justification for AUKUS. So China did appear in the AUKMIN, statement, but the British Foreign and Defence Secretaries are happy to say, yes, one of the reasons we need AUKUS is because we've got to respond to China's massive military build-up, whereas the government won't say the word China and the word AUKUS in the same sentence. They've gone from speaking frankly about China when they first got in, when they inherited the national security template of the previous government to now not speaking about it at all. And the other thing they've done, which China will be very happy with, is they're not doing anything on defence. They've got all these AUKUS plans for 10 years hence and 20 years hence and so on. But in the 3 years they will have been in government, they've made no increase in defence expenditure, and they haven't increased a single military capability, instead of which they've cut the size of the surface fleet. They've retired one of the Anzacs. They're going to retire a second one. We don't actually increase the size of the surface fleet until 2034 at the earliest. They've abolished the last squadron of the Joint Strike Fighters. They're not going to upgrade the Collins with Tomahawks. In every way, they've reduced our military capability. And I think what you've got is a government, for the first time, a Labor government dominated by the factional left. You know, they're good people, they're good, honest, patriotic Australians, but they have no interest in national security. And Richard Marles, the notional hawk, just has no influence in the government.
What do you make of that news we've heard today that Britain's set to declare China a threat to national security after 2 cyber campaigns targeting their politicians? We learned this week too, officially out of New Zealand, that there was a cyber attack on their parliament by China. They named China. We've not been so strong here on that in Australia. But if Britain goes down this path, surely this is something we should have on the table.
Well, you're absolutely right, Peter. I mean, this is getting to be truly weird now. You're getting a more frank, honest, meaningful, detailed discussion of Indo-Pacific security out of London than you're getting out of Canberra. Now, Penny Wong made a speech. I'm a bit of a fan of Penny Wong, but she made a speech at the ASEAN conference in which she talked about the threats to maritime security, but didn't mention China by name. And this was enough to enrage Paul Keating, even though she didn't mention China by name. Now, then in a press conference with Wang Yi, she did say, you know, outline Australia's disagreements with China, but she's the only one. The Prime Minister doesn't do it. The Defence Minister doesn't do it. And the juxtaposition in timing is telling here. So Wang Yi, the Chinese Foreign Minister, comes to Australia. We all roll over. He tickles our tummy. Isn't this wonderful? You know, he has a wonderful meeting with Paul Keating, who says everything's fabulous in the Chinese government, and our government is celebrating the renewed wonderful relationship. And then it turns out that all through this time, China has been engaging in the most savage cyber attacks on Australian, British, American and New Zealand government systems, voting rolls, the machinery of government, so much so that even Britain, which is never looking to pick a fight with China, is now saying it's going to declare China a threat to British national security because of its aggressive cyber intrusions. And yet the Albanese government, so when it first came in, it just inherited the playbook from the previous government and had the wit to stick with it. But now it's asserting its normal identity, which is apparently to say nothing. And also, of course, you can't sustain the public. The public doesn't understand what's going on if you never tell them.
Just really quickly, Greg, I mean, we've had that word today that there is now a heightened, it's at the highest level, terror threat in France. It's prompted our guys here in Australia at DFAT to issue a travel warning in relation to France. This all goes back to Islamic terrorism. We know Mike Burgess, when he was in the room at NSC, was warning us about the likelihood of an Islamist attack in Australia over the next 12 months. This is a concern.
Oh, it really is, Peter. So this is grotesque that you would expel the head of ASIO and the head of ASIS from the National Security Committee at a time like this. Of course, they'll be there when terrorism is formally considered. But it's up to the authorities to raise the threat level, and I don't have any secret information about that. But American intelligence warned the Russians of an imminent attack. The French believe an attack is imminent. Afghanistan is now a permissive environment for terrorism. We know Islamic State is reviving there and in other countries. Australia has been a juicy target in the past. You've got this heightened, fevered emotion about Gaza and the Palestinians. So I think, you know, without any secret information, I think the danger of a terrorist attack has become, you know, much higher than it was 6 months ago.
Well, I don't want to end on a discordant note, Greg. To you and Josie, happy Holy Easter, and I hope you get a little bit of a break over the next few days. We'll speak to you when you're back. All right, after the break, strip clubs, drug festivals. These are just some of the things that NDIS providers are reportedly offering their clients. There's a bigger list than that. I'll take you through where your money's being wasted after the break. Kell Richards in a moment, but let's bring in my panel now. Shadow Environment Minister Jonathan Duniam and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre, columnist, of course, with The Australian, Nick Caton. Well, Nick, let's start with the NDIS. All the rorts. I mean, I've stopped being shocked by them. It's a $42 billion scheme. But on radio this morning, Bedford went through some extra ones I didn't know about. I mean, I knew about the strip clubs, but you've now got providers offering to take clients on pub crawls, even a weed or marijuana festival near Byron Bay. Bill Shorten says, yes, we're going to reform it. He's put laws into the parliament, says he's going to crack down on it all. But what sort of hope do you have that Labor's serious here?
Well, this is the problem, Peter, and I think probably as you've seen today, you've got the states involved. I mean, who actually runs this thing? It seems that the federal government don't seem to be able to do anything without the state's approval, and they're not going to approve this if it involves a lack of money. But you put your finger on the problem here, it's provider capture on an enormous scale. You've got these provider groups, some are very good, but a lot of them have just learnt very well how to get the most money out of the system, presumably on behalf of their client, but so much of it, of course, is self-serving. And Labor's got to fix this. It's Labor's problem. It's Labor's scheme. All the faults embedded in this scheme were put in there by Labor back in the Gillard days. It has to fix it, and it has to fix it this term of government.
And you are spot on too, because the way it's constructed, every state's got to agree, and the spend is uncapped. So if you're a pink bat sort of a dodgy guy, and we saw them, remember, in the Gillard years, this is a honeypot. But I mean, these things should be ruled out. I mean, it's sex trips and weed trips. No, it's for medical care and medical care only. Jono, talk to me about the Northern Territory, because your colleague today, Jacinta Price, she's had a bit to say about this late-breaking news about a curfew after riots on the streets in Alice Springs. Have a listen.
This situation will get worse if it is not dealt with, and dealt with immediately. Prime Minister Albanese needs to go back to Alice Springs, needs to deploy the ADF, needs to have a presence in our community to make the people of Alice Springs feel some sense of safety once and for all.
I tell you, geez, we love her. I mean, she speaks from the heart there. I mean, yes, there's a curfew, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. These kids have got to be out in the street, that's allowed, but after 6 o'clock at night, they've got to be home and stay home. But I think the army's a real prospect, isn't it? Surely we should be thinking about it, Jono.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. I think the best thing the PM could do would be to take the advice of a local. Jacinta isn't a fly-in politician. She lives there. That's her community. She knows what needs to happen. I had a chat with her today about this, and they don't need tokenistic sort of responses. They need a presence, as she says. The ADF, a presence there of that nature would certainly be very helpful. The PM should actually do his job and get out, go and understand from the community directly. As I understand it, is that even now the PM hasn't been in touch with the Chief Minister to understand how the federal government can help with this situation. So yes, Jacinta is right. Get in there and make sure that there is a presence, and we actually can enforce some civility in that community. They need it desperately. Jacinta is absolutely right.
And I'll tell you what, he wanted voices from local communities, Aboriginal voices, to tell him what they wanted. She couldn't have been any clearer there. Hey, Nick, the Cash Transport Company, we all used to see it on the streets in its big Armour Guard vans, Armour Guard. It's in trouble. A lot of retailers and banks don't use it. It's struggling to stay afloat. It's had a bit of a lifeline in the last day or so, but it's just highlighting, isn't it? If this is the last cash carrier in Australia, it tells me that cash is disappearing, and that's a worry.
Well, it's a big worry, Peter. I mean, I like using cash. I use it whenever I can, which is increasingly less these days. But look, I really think that this is something that the government, the Reserve Bank and those responsible for cash flow need to look into, because we do actually basically need cash at ATMs, in shops, because not everybody can use a card. Some people don't want to use a card. Some people prefer cash management because it's easier not to, spend too much. I really think, I think we really have to look at this as a national issue and determine what needs to be done to make sure we can get cash out there into the economy, circulating the economy, powering the economy.
And I might add too, the Treasurer has got to step in. If a business is forcing us only to use a card, if they won't let us pay with legal tender in cash, then they can't be charging us merchant fees on a direct debit card or anything like that. Fine on a credit card, but if they won't let us use cash, get rid of those merchants' fees. Johnny, before we go, Tassie, what's happening there? Are the Libs any closer to forming government?
Well, Peter, in good news, it looks like we will have a fourth-term Liberal government, albeit in minority, which was not unexpected. I mean, it's 4 terms. It's very hard for a government to secure a fourth term. Jeremy Rockcliffe has, with the support, hopefully, and all of that will be worked out once the count is completed, but of the Lambie party, Jackie Lambie has been indicating that she wants to work with the government. And she realises, thankfully, that she has a job to do, and that is to provide stability for the Tasmanian community. What is a striking outcome of this election, of course, is that after 3 elections and 10 years, Beck White and the Labor Party have failed to make any ground. They have failed to resonate with the Tasmanian community and have a vote in the 20s. That is astounding. They should have had this election stitched up, but they didn't. So thankfully, common sense and hopefully some stability will reign for the next 4 years.
I think there's a flight of people back to the major parties, and I think the Greens, hopefully, are in trouble at the next federal election. Well, I hope I'm right there. Have a good Easter, gents. See you next week. All right, quick break. Kell after the break. Welcome back. Joining me, as he does every Wednesday, my dear friend Kell Richards. I thought of this one last night because I had a couple of people, Kell, after the show. I spoke to a psychiatrist, Dr. Andrew Amos. We talked about gender medicine and young kids, and he talked about it being at odds with the Hippocratic Oath. A few emails came in saying, just remind me, Peter, what this Hippocratic Oath is. Well, we're going to ask you, Kell, what is it and where did it originate?
OK, it's an oath traditionally taken by doctors when they graduate, which spells out their professional and ethical responsibilities as doctors. In English, it goes back to 1747, but the original document, an ancient Greek document, goes back to Hippocrates, who was born in 460 BC. And it was an oath to do the right thing. Let me read you the very opening words of the important part of the oath. There are some opening bits in which Hippocrates says, look after your teachers and so on. But then the first oath is, I will use those procedures which will benefit my patients and will do no harm to them. And when people say something doesn't fit with the Hippocratic Oath, they're saying it's that do no harm which is being violated. I think that, do you think that's what they're worried about?
That is the most important thing, do no harm. Let's talk about Beyond the Pale, because one of our viewers, Simon, wants to know, where's that one come from?
The Pale was a protective fence around Irish towns, and it was stakes driven into the ground. We get our word paling for the paling fence from the same source. And if someone was unacceptable within the community, they behaved badly, they were ejected from the town and they had to move outside the protection of the safe fence that guarded the town. So they were beyond the pale.
Oh, I did not know that one. Annie, and I must put my hand up to say I'm guilty of this one. Annie wants to know, what is the origin of all the uses of the word pretty? You know, yes, a person can look pretty, but we also say pretty hot, pretty cold, pretty good, pretty bad. Where's that come from?
It's really flexible because it's so old. It is there at the beginning of the English language 1,200 years ago, and it came from a Germanic source word originally meaning something like cunningly made or crafty, something like that. Then over time it changed a bit. It came to mean well made, particularly in a sense of being elegant or being diminutive, so it was applied to children or young women. And it's changed again. And in the 20th century, it's come to be used to be applied to something which is made in such a way you can't quite name it. It's an adjective which is an unnameable quantity. It just means more or less, or sort of, or approximately. So it can be pretty good, pretty bad, pretty much whatever. It's just 1,000 years of history and a lot of changes.
All right, Kell, have a happy Easter. To my wonderful viewers too, have a happy and holy Easter. Please stay safe on the roads, Australia. I'm not with you tomorrow night. I'm off with my mum for Easter, but I'll be back here on Tuesday night. I look forward to your company then.